This is a long-term review of the Sony A7RV. We're not going to be touching too much on specs, but more how this actually handles and helps me and why I believe this is the best hybrid camera you can buy on the market right now.
This video is sponsored by PPA. Join a community of over 35,000 photographers, find equipment insurance, education, and business tools made specifically for small business owners like you.
It's fast. What do I mean by that? Well, the camera feels really fast to use. Now, we talk about this and how it impacts our work for computers, but we don't really talk about it enough for cameras. If a computer's slow, it slows you down. If the camera is fast, it just makes it easier to use and more enjoyable to use because you're not having to wait for it to do certain things. Things like formatting cards, scrolling through the menus, turn on times, going between different modes. Those are all things that you do hundreds, probably thousands of times a year. And that time really adds up. Doing the same task compared to like my A7S3 or FX3, this is noticeably faster. Now, the key to this camera being such a good hybrid for me is the switch on the back right here. You can go between photo and video super fast and you don't really have to wait for it to load. It's almost instantaneous, and the settings that you have between each mode are retained. You can completely separate them. So if you have one set of settings and shutter speeds and an aperture using in video, but it's completely different for photo, which it normally is, you can swap back and forth and it keeps those settings. There's also a little lock on here, which means you can't accidentally change it. This dial has been perfectly implemented and is huge for me after using this camera for the past 6 months or so. If you've had an A7S3, I mean, not if you've had an A7 IV because you'll already be used to this, but you may have shot photos in log by accident and you don't realize till you get into Lightroom and then it's too late. Well, you don't do that on here. You can turn your picture profile on for video, off for photo, and you don't have to worry about taking photos in log. Now, when you buy a hybrid camera, you typically don't get all of the best from a video camera and all of the best from like a dedicated stills camera. You don't normally get that all mashed up together. This was the first Sony camera that I truly felt like it had everything I need put into one. Been looking at the A7 IV for the longest time, but the crop factor in 4K 60 for me just meant that not usable for certain situations. But as soon as I saw this camera, it just made logical sense. For video, you get 10-bit 422 S-Log3, you get S-Cinetone, you get the Gamma Assist on there so you can view like Sony's LUT live. Now, there is no second base ISOs or higher ISO performance, but for personal shooting for myself, I'm never really needing that when it comes to video, so if I did, I would use the FX3. There's something you get in this that you actually don't even get in the A7S3 and the FX3, and that's being able to crop in 4K 24 and in 4K 30 frames per second to get 1.5 times more reach out of whatever lens that you're using. You don't have that in the A7S3 and the FX3 because they use different sensors. That sensor prioritizes low light performance because it has bigger pixels in its 12 megapixel sensor. This has a 60 megapixel sensor, which means you can crop into APS-C mode and still have a 4K image. It's not something I'm using a ton, but when I do need it, I need that little bit more reach because I'm on a prime or something like that. Super useful. But long story short, this is an extremely powerful video shooter for most scenarios for me. Now, although I don't talk about the fact that I do take photos, I don't ever claim to be a photographer, but when I started to travel more as part of my work, it's something I started to think about a little bit more. Although 12 megapixels from like the FX3 is enough, I wanted a little bit more. That's for a variety of practical reasons. Nobody really needs 60 megapixels until you need 60 megapixels. And what do I mean by this? It just gives you options after the fact. I'll liken it to taking photos in RAW. There's a reason we shoot in RAW. If you want to change things afterwards, you can. 60 megapixels lets you reframe, crop in with huge flexibility.
This many megapixels, you barely need to own a telephoto.
So if I'm shooting in locations that I might potentially never go back to or capturing events that I might never get to see again, this gives me options when I get back to edit the photos. I might decide that I wanted to change the framing a little bit, or I got the framing wrong, or it's crooked completely and I need to fix that. I can fix it with 60 megapixels and have tons of play. On top of that, with it being 60 megapixels, that crop factor again becomes really useful. Every lens gets that equivalent look of 1.5 times more reach. But with the kicker here of that image is still 26 megapixels when it's in crop mode. Also, with this kind of being a primarily camera focused channel, I'm testing a lot of lenses and sometimes I'm pixel peeping, and 12 megapixels wasn't really enough. Now, this is really purely for me, kind of selfish to talk about, but if you really want the most out of a lens, you want to see the sharpness best, the imperfections the best, you need high megapixels. So 60 megapixels kind of made sense. Now, don't get me wrong, the files that this produces are absolutely massive. There are options in here to quickly change how big you want the files to be. Medium is 26 megapixels and the smallest is 15 megapixels. So you have options.
This video is sponsored by PPA, the Professional Photographers of America. They're a non-profit and a long-time supporter of the channel. My favorite thing with PPA, and I think one of the most popular things for a lot of people out there, is just by having a membership with PPA, you get up to $15,000 of photography equipment insurance. That basic insurance is very straightforward. If you need a repair, it's a $50 flat fee deductible. And for equipment loss or a full replacement, $350 flat fee deductible. Super simple. And if you need a little bit more comprehensive coverage, they actually can give you a discount through one of their partners called Locked On Affinity. This just gives you the peace of mind knowing if something does happen to your gear, you are not without your gear and then basically without your business. Huge thing if you're new as well, customizable, downloadable contracts that you can tailor specifically to your business needs. That's all just part of the membership as well.
You also got access to their Bridging the Gap curriculum, which is over 900 videos that are going to help you run and manage your business a little bit better. They're going to teach you things like branding, understanding the market. If you've never done sales before, it's going to really help you with the psychology of sales and closing clients, how to make more money. Just a bunch of really helpful videos that are going to help you and your business do better.
If you want to learn more about PPA, head down below, click on that link, and if you do want to sign up for a membership, that will actually get you a special discount as well. Thank you, PPA, for sponsoring this video.
The IBIS on this, and what I mean by IBIS is the active stabilization, the one that gives you the little 0.1 crop, is absolutely ridiculous on this camera. On paper, 8 stops of stabilization, you hear that, you see that. You can't really fathom what that can do for you until you start actually using it. The first time we all tested this camera, the IBIS was a big standout feature for us because Sony hasn't typically been known as being great when it comes to stabilization with cameras, and this was the first time that wasn't the case. For video, it's the closest I've ever seen with a Sony camera to like tripod level footage. You can walk with it, and it's definitely not gimbal level, but it's leaps and bounds ahead of the FX3. You put those side by side and you will tell a big difference. On top of that, if you're using a massive tele-zoom lens, when you're zooming right in and shakes are a lot more obvious, this just performs so well. It's helped me get shots for video that I would have very likely needed to have used a tripod for. The first time I used this for video at a wedding, I look back at the footage after and it made me question the entire way I shoot weddings. Now that's a pretty bold statement because once you get into a rhythm and a habit of the way you shoot things, you use specific equipment all the time. This was the first time in a long time that I've kind of thought I could change that. I had the 50mm f1.2 on this and the 135 f1.8, and the footage is just ridiculously stable for being handheld. Even now, I genuinely can't believe how good it looks. I've gone through all the phases shooting weddings, tripods, then to monopods. Then monopods just started to get in the way. They weren't quick enough to move around, so I opted to start using gimbals for a lot of things. But for certain shots now, I can just use this not on a gimbal and it will get me the same thing. And for photos, this opens up opportunities to shoot in a way that I haven't shot before. What I mean by that is like handheld photos. I can shoot a long exposure of a waterfall or river. It's completely tack sharp still. Before, I would have had to have shot something like that with a slower shutter speed like that on a tripod, which also means this is better for low light environments for photos because you can drop down to a much lower shutter speed and not worry again about things not being sharp. The IBIS in this camera is a very useful feature, and for some, I can honestly believe that it will be a reason to get this camera because it's that good. Now, I know there's other camera brands out there that have had IBIS this level for a while. Panasonic, Olympus. We haven't had it this good in Sony cameras before, and that's why it's such a big deal for us. Not going to go out and change brands just for IBIS, but if we're already with Sony with a bunch of glass, we're going to start using that feature a lot. The screen. This is hands down the best screen that I've ever used in a Sony camera, and I've tried all of the Sony mirrorless cameras for 2 reasons. Not just for the fact that it is the highest res screen, being 2.1 million dots, the A7S3, FX3, all other Sony cameras, 1.4 million dots. And that's noticeable when you start using it. Way clearer. Really nice. It's like using a Canon camera. You know, you use a Canon camera and the Sony camera, you notice immediately the difference in quality of screens. We're close to you now, Canon, with the Sony screen here on the A7RV. Although, fun fact, the FX30 actually has the same screen as this, which is kind of a strange choice. But also because this is a 4-axis multi-angle touch screen. Now, if you shoot video, you normally want the flippy screen for shooting low angles, high angles, filming yourself. You know the deal, you want the flip screen. But when it comes to shooting stills, I don't love the flip screen. If I'm not using the EVF and I'm shooting lower angle, I don't know, there's something about photos that I just don't like where it's out to the side like this. I don't like it extending from the body. Don't ask me why. It feels very different to shoot with photos of the screen like this than it does to video, and I don't like it for photos. So I kind of want the screen that does that. And this does both. very, very well. Again, I know it's been on other cameras for a while, but it's the first time we've had this functionality in a Sony camera. It's really nice that Sony, and I know they do, they listen to the features that we want to use and they implement them into the cameras in the future. Now, I've had this out all different ways, very many times, and the hinge on here is not in the slightest bit looser than when it turned up and I opened it out and put it out the box. That was a really long way of saying I took it out of the box. It feels good still. The A7S3 screen, when I had it after a while, it did get loose. I did have to send it back. I'm sure there was an issue with the hinge that they've now fixed, but there's no issues with the hinge on this. So those are the features that really have stood out to me as what makes this camera the best hybrid in the market right now. The A7 IV is a great alternative, but that 4K 60 crop, that really like kind of hindered me and I didn't like that. So this just made sense. And this is the best hybrid right now. Now, with all that said and done, is there anything that bothers me about the A7RV? Well, just this past weekend, I actually had it freeze on me twice. And what I mean by freezing, the back of the screen had a bunch of weird colors that came on. I have to turn the camera off and turn it back on again before I could use it again. And that's never happened. Now, it was very hot at the weekend when I was shooting a wedding, so I don't know if it overheated, and that was its way of saying it overheated without even showing me. But that happened twice, not when I'm recording, so that's okay. But that makes me a little bit skeptical. Maybe that's a firmware thing that is only in the current firmware. It might get changed. I don't know, but I wanted to share that with you. Now, the other thing is not really more of a bother, but it's more of an ask. This has the same chip in it as the ZVE1, the AI chip, and that has some incredible features that I would really love to see Sony put into this. Things like the stabilization when you are, it's the step above active stabilization. It gives you even more of a crop, but like, it's very, very close to gimbal level. So I'd love to see that in here. The other big one is the auto reframing. I absolutely love that feature. For someone that shoots on their own, that wants to mimic the handheld look of someone actually filming me and I'm just on my own, it does it very, very well. Also, imagine having 8K with auto reframing to be able to crop into you for vertical, for landscape. That would be incredibly useful. But will we see it? I don't know. It's the same chip. We should. Who knows? That's it. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Take care.